Hi there, this is a relatively short video to quickly explain the most popular techniques used in synthesizers to create sounds. I already did a video on the history of music synthesis, and you can see the link in the description below. But this one will focus on explaining and describing the differences between the various synthesis techniques using some examples. I believe this is a good video if you want to better understand the various terms utilized in music synthesis jargon to describe the type of synthesis you're using. So here is a list of the different music synthesis techniques we'll describe in this video. This include not only different ways to generate sounds, but also different ways to implement these techniques. You might sometimes see these terms in the literature or on the internet, so I thought it would be good to explain all those terms in this presentation. If you want to know more about other techniques or need a deeper explanation, please drop a comment and I will be happy to help, if I can. I'll start with modular synthesis because it qualifies the first way of making sounds using electronic technology. And you may find quite a few different hardware or software synthesizers which are labeled as modular synthesizers. But what does modular synthesis mean? Well, it means that they follow the same architecture as the first generation of electronic synthesizers, such as the Moog Modular, the ARP, or the Buchla box. Their common ground is the fact that you can use separate entities called modules, which are connected to each other using cables or connectors or whatever, to generate and manipulate all kinds of sounds. So depending on how you interconnect more or less complex modules, you can actually generate all kinds of analog music synthesis. Analog here means using non-digital electronic components to manipulate electric currents, which can then be directly transformed into sounds using loudspeakers. So what do I mean by non-digital electronic components? Well, that means resistors, capacitors, transistors, inductors, etc., but no microprocessor. That means no computer, no software. For example, you could use one electronic board or module to create a triangular wave, and its output could be connected to a second module that would modulate the volume or the amplitude of the signal. And then its output would be connected to a low-pass filter module, for instance, which eliminates some of the high frequencies of the sound, etc., etc. So let's listen to an example of sounds created in a Moog modular system. So what we've seen so far is how to use electronic components to create sounds. Electric variations of the generated signals are converted to sound variations using a speaker, for example. But the advent of microprocessors in the 70s and the 80s allowed to calculate math functions which could create oscillating curves, and then to convert the resulting functions to sound using digital to analog converters. Hence the name, Digital Synthesis. And these math functions calculated by microprocessors could very easily mimic the behavior of electronic, that is, analog signals. They could even simulate the imperfections of the analog electronic circuitries found in the original analog synthesizers. And that was called virtual analog synthesis because it sounded like analog synthesis, but actually was a simulated, calculated version of analog synthesis. But we'll talk about this in a minute. Okay, so far we've been talking about music synthesis implementation technologies rather than pure music synthesis. It's now time to study actual music synthesis techniques. In order to do that, there's something we need to know. Any sound can be decomposed as a sum of very basic sounds, namely sine waves. For instance, the waveform at the bottom is equal to the sum of the two sine waves above it. This looks quite obvious here, but bear in mind that any waveform, that means any sound, can be expressed like this as a sum of two or more sine waves. Usually the sine wave with the lowest frequency, here the one at the top, corresponds to the note frequency. For example, here, if the sine wave at the top oscillates 110 times per second, that is 110 Hertz, you will hear an A note. The sine wave itself sounds and looks like this. So if you combine, in other words, add sine waves of various frequencies, amplitudes, and phases, you can create any sound. The simplest ones, which do not vary in time, are the sums of one sine wave, which has a frequency corresponding to a note, and of other sine waves called harmonics, which have frequencies multiple of the note frequency. Okay, that may be a little abstract. Let's take an example. If we take the sine wave at 110 Hz that we've just seen and add to it certain specific sine waves, we can get a square wave. Now let me make an important comment. Note that the square wave is not perfect. Normally it should look like this. The one we created looks like that. You may have noticed the little wigglings when the signal abruptly changes and the square lines are not perfectly horizontal nor vertical. All these little imperfections are typical of actual electronic circuits. So this could be an analog synthesis example, but of course I'm creating the signals with a computer, so this actually is virtual analog synthesis. Okay, so by just adding other sine waves to an original sine wave, we change the sound, or timbre, of the synthesizer sound. And this is why it is called additive synthesis, because we're merely adding basic sine waves to create a sound. But we can create much more complex sounds by only adding certain harmonics and changing their respective amplitudes or volumes, and make them vary over time, like in this example. Also note that instead of adding harmonics with frequencies which are only multiple of the original notes, we can use inharmonics, which are sine waves whose frequencies could be anything. And you can that way create evolutive sounds like metallic sounds, for instance. Check this. And on top of that, you can also filter out some of the harmonics that you have created, which leads us to the next type of synthesis, the famous subtractive synthesis. The same way we could add multiple sine waves to create richer sounds with additive synthesis, we can remove or subtract certain harmonics from rich sounds composed of many sine waves. The most used example comes from the Minimoog, one of the most popular synths which introduced music synthesis to the mass. It consists in using a low-pass filter to remove all higher harmonics above a certain frequency called the cutoff frequency. This can drastically transform an aggressive sound full of high frequencies into a smooth and soft sound, like in this example. Okay, here I cheated a bit by adding some reverb, but still you could hear the impact of subtracting high frequencies and re-adding them. Of course, we can do the same with modern synthesizers, in which we can also use a high-pass filter to remove the low-frequency harmonics, thus creating a lo-fi sound like this. Now, these are the simplest ways to implement subtractive synthesis and also are the easiest to build using electronic components. But they also are the most effective ones, as you could hear before. And of course, there are many other ways to remove bunches of harmonics or sine waves from a rich signal. We'll see some examples in a few minutes. So, the simplest structure to create a synthesized sound is called an oscillator. Why? Well, because it creates an oscillating electric signal, which, when sent to a speaker, will make its membrane vibrate at the same frequencies, thereby creating air vibration that will hit your eardrum and let your brain perceive the corresponding sound. And an oscillator can create a pure sine wave, a triangular wave, a square wave, a sawtooth wave, etc. Now, like all the parameters in a synthesizer, the frequency of the oscillator can be modulated, which means it can be controlled not only by the key you press on your keyboard to create a specific note, but also by other parameters. Modulations are a very important concept in music synthesis. And in the early 80s, Yamaha decided to modulate the frequency of an oscillator using another oscillator. But let's first look at one oscillator structure. The source provides the original shape of the signal, for instance a sine wave, which is then amplified by the voltage control amplifier, or VCA. But the VCA itself can be modulated by an envelope generator, which will shape the signal by modulating its amplitude, for instance with a slow attack, a long release, etc. The resulting signal can then be sent to filters or any other modules, as we've seen before. And now we can get back to our current topic, frequency modulation. The idea here is to use not one, but two oscillators, with the first one's output connected to the input of the second one. This technique allows to obtain specific sound variations, otherwise more complicated to obtain with additive synthesis, for example. In particular, it creates inharmonics, which make sounds evolve in time, for example, for metallic bell sounds. Here's an example with the Iconet DX7, which also allowed multiple combinations of oscillators to create complex waveforms using FM. Note that the frequency modulations can be applied at any time during the sound building. For instance, here we can apply FM after the sound has been already modified by other parameters. In the late 70s, the advent of microprocessors and digital synthesis brought the capability of saving digitally recorded sound samples, called samples for short. These samples were meant to replace the classic oscillators to serve as sources of waveforms to be then manipulated, modulated, filtered, etc., to create even more interesting and complex sounds. So now, instead of generating simple mathematical waveforms like sine waves, triangular waves, square waves, etc., to be used as sources, the synthesis algorithms were able to start with much more complex waveforms, merely recorded and played back to serve as source oscillators, like in this example here. And you can completely change the flavor of your sound by simply changing the source sample. And then, of course, the same filters, modulators, and other effects could be applied just like with simple wave oscillators. But we can do more than just adding filter and modulation stages to the sample playback. We can use granular synthesis. Granular synthesis consists in chopping the sampled recording into small chunks of audio, called grains. These grains can have various sizes, usually pretty small, and can be played more or less rapidly. They can be played in a more or less random order, and some specific filtering can be applied to them too, and all these manipulations can sometimes yield to very interesting effects. Here are some application examples. And of course, these are but a few examples of granular synthesis use. Another way to use pre-recorded audio samples is to organize them in sets or tables, which are indexed so that you can access specific samples in the set based on various sources. For example, access different samples of the same instrument based on the velocity of the played notes. That way the sound will be different if you hit a key softly or strongly. You can, for instance, record all the notes of a piano, with each note being recorded at various velocities. And then, based on the MIDI velocity of the note played by the synthesizer, not only the notes will be played at different volumes, but the sound will be based on how strongly the hammer hits the piano string, making it sound more realistic. Now, wavetables can also be used to record a lengthy audio sample and split it into small pieces that can be accessed separately to achieve some special effects. Around 1990, vector synthesis was invented by synthesizer genius Dave Smith, who incidentally also invented MIDI protocol. It is just a way to gracefully mix several sources or command several parameters at once using a 2D joystick. In other words, in vector synthesis, you can combine and mix up to 4 elements at once using a joystick. It was in particular implemented by Dave in the Prophet VS and in the Korg Wave Station, also co-developed by Dave Smith. Here is an example of the joystick use using an emulation of the Prophet VS by Arturia. Another sophisticated type of synthesis is called physical modeling synthesis. As the name implies, it consists in mimicking the behavior of natural instruments by modeling with mathematical function the behavior of all physical elements involved. For instance, some math function will calculate string vibrations in a violin based on how the bow hits and glides on the strings, and other functions will calculate the effects of the casing, its shape, the wood that is used, etc., etc. It's obviously very complicated to implement and necessitates a computing power which was only available since the last years of computer evolution. While the result was a bit disappointing until recently, there is now enough processing power in latest generations of computers to obtain impressive results. Well, you should now have a pretty good idea of what the various popular synthesis techniques are. I would also strongly recommend that you watch the History of Synthesizers video. It's not only a great way to understand the different synthesis history, but also there are many examples of various syntheses used at the end of the video. I also talk about the use of AI in music synthesis. Anyway, I hope this short video gave you a good idea of what the most popular synthesis techniques are and how they are used. Take care and go make music!